Good morning, this is Mr. Melendez, and I'm bringing you today's lesson topic 7.10 End of the Cold War. So, this video is going to be primarily broken up into three parts. The first part is kind of giving you a kind of overview of what happens after World War II and the start of the Cold War, and kind of give you a very loose timeline up to the present, which is we're talking about the end of the Cold War, which starts to begin in the middle of the 1980s. The second part is diving into the actual PowerPoint Google slides. I'm not going to go over every slide, but I'm only going to be talking about certain particular slides and concepts that are introduced to the Soviet Union and starts to kind of contribute to the end of the Cold War and how the Soviet Union starts to go in this downward spiral and eventually collapse. And the third part will be kind of like going over the documents and what you actually need to do for this assignment. So let's go ahead and jump. You see the video, my screen in front of you, kind of giving you the different steps. We will talk about the steps towards the end of the video. Let's go ahead, and if you move down here, there is gonna be a second video that you're gonna be able to access, and that would be this one that you're listening to. But you have three things here. You have the Google Slides of the PowerPoint presentation. You have the Google Docs, which is actually the assignment itself, where you have your documents that you're going to have to work on and the questions that you have to answer. And then a brief video of President Ronald Reagan's Berlin Wall speech that he makes. And it's very important because one of the documents that you're going to be reading is his actual speech. So it would be nice to see the video kind of like a read aloud, and I want you to pay attention to the video because I want you to hear how he delivers his speech. It's a very iconic speech, and the way that he emphasized certain words and how he brings the speech to life is really fascinating. So let's go ahead and jump right to it into the Google Slides. So our focus question for today is, how did the Cold War end? And we're going to kind of give you a very narrow lens and kind of concentrate on how the Cold War starts after World War II. And the Cold War is not a war, not like a traditional war, not like World War II or maybe the Korean War, Vietnam War, where you have armies on both sides and soldiers and they're shooting and killing each other. The Cold War is not like that. What the Cold War is this cat and mouse game that we play with the Russians, with the Soviet Unions. We do a lot of spying, we do a lot of espionage. We're trying to kind of go win one over and be more technologically advanced. We're going in and spying on what it is, what kind of technologies that they have. And the Soviet Union is doing the same thing as well to us. And we're playing this game, and throughout the years we see that, as things starts to escalate, and they start to escalate, especially when we talk about the lesson with President John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Russia or the Soviet Union is supplying weapons of mass destruction, basically nuclear weapons, into Cuba. And Cuba, a pretty significant island, but is only 90 miles away from the United States coast. So where Florida is, the tip of Florida all the way down to the island itself is only 90 miles away. So we see that in the Cold War, in the beginnings of the Cold War, Russia, where they're located, is starting to spread their influence into different countries. And we start to see like places like China adopts communism, and we see Korea adopts communism, and Vietnam, which were separate lessons that we talked about before the spring break. And we start seeing that Russia and communism, they're starting to spread their influence into these different into their part of the world. And the United States is trying to combat this, right? We kind of gave it a terminology that's called the domino theory, or the domino effect, which is if one domino falls, it hits the next domino, and it just kind of like have this effect where it starts knocking over the domino. And what that means is that with this one big push that comes from the Soviet Union and their influence in communism, that they are the first domino to fall, and then countries that they're influencing like China and Korea and Vietnam and other countries that surround them are starting to fall and start to accept communism. And the United States is very aware that they need to stop the spread of communism. They need to stop it in their tracks so that way they can continue with a more democratic society, not just for the United States, but for other countries and for protection. We want to surround ourselves with and align ourselves with countries that have the same governmental views as we do, and that way we can kind of align ourselves together and offer each other protection. And we see this with this side of the world where the Soviet Union is, right? We have some successes in stopping the spread of communism. When it comes to the Korean War, North Korea, or the northern part of Korea, is trying to invade the southern part and take over as one united Korean nation. And the United States goes in and is successful in stopping the spread, but we're not successful in liberating the entire Korean peninsula. So we have this divided nation. We're not successful when we move into Vietnam, where Vietnam adopts, and we have North Vietnam and South Vietnam, where South Vietnam is more democratic and North Vietnam starts adopting communism, and it just becomes too much for the United States. We end up going in more as advisors and a police force, and we end up having this long, drawn out war, and it's no good, and we end up losing the war and we leave. What this does is that now that we go back a little bit to JFK and we get to this part in the Cuban Missile Crisis where we come to the brink of destruction, that we start to realize, both countries start to realize, that we need to have some kind of balance and peace with each other because we don't want to blow each other up. So we start making these pacts and these peace, and little by little it starts working very well for the United States. But then eventually throughout the years, the Soviet Union is starting to experience some fallout where the Soviet Union has certain countries, kind of like satellite states around them, that are not doing so well. During this time frame, we see that the Soviet Union enters a war with Afghanistan and really doesn't do very well. So not only are they losing to the Afghanis, but they're not advancing in technology. Their army is kind of getting decimated a little bit. They're starting to lose people because the Afghanis are very good in fighting back. And financially, the Soviet Union is not doing very well. So we get to this phase where now we're going to start talking about how the Soviet Union introduces these concepts, these governmental concepts, and it starts to begin the downward spiral of how it begins to end with the Cold War and finally the Soviet Union and communism collapsing, and the United States no longer is in this Cold War with Soviet Union because they can't really sustain themselves or their influence in that part of the world. So let's go ahead and let's advance in our Google Slides. So if you go to slide 2, we have this concept called non-aligned movement. And what that means is that it's this accepted international policy of a sovereign state, which means self-governing, according to which it does not align itself to any of the power blocks. We mentioned in previous lessons that a power block is like a very big country and influence, like the United States and Russia. So these sovereign states are not aligning themselves to a particular bloc. They're not aligning themselves to either the United States or to Russia, but at the same time, they are actively participating in world affairs. And what they want to do is they want to promote peace and harmony and cooperation, right? Some of these sovereign states joined NATO, all right, or excuse me, joined the UN, the United Nations. They're not aligning themselves. They're kind of like independently, they're on their own, but they do want to see world peace. And we're starting to see this happen because it's happening to the Soviet Union. And I'll show you a map of how surrounding certain country states are starting to spread their wings and kind of break away from the Soviet Union. And this is what's going to start causing this non-alignment movement. If we go to part 3, we see that just what I explained, the features of non-alignment movement, not really aligned to the United States or to the Soviet Union. They oppose any military alliance like NATO or the Warsaw Pact, which NATO is what the United States kind of bought into, and the Warsaw Pact is what the Soviet Union bought into. Freedom to make its independent decisions. They're not influenced by other countries. They're standalone. They're independent. And uninterested in international problems and politics. This is kind of like, what the founding fathers of our countries wanted to do in the beginning, is to kind of stay away of foreign affairs and foreign problems. These non-alignment movement type of sovereign states are disinterested in those type of problems. They're kind of like keeping to themselves. All right. So the objective of these non-alignment movements is to eliminate all causes which lead to war. They want to have peace. That's their biggest thing. All right. So they definitely oppose colonialism, imperialism, and racial discrimination. They don't want other countries to come in and try to establish a colony or try to have some kind of big influence like the UK, right? You have Great Britain, which they have this big influence over Ireland and Scotland, and all three of them to combine as you call them the United Kingdom. These type of countries don't want that type of influence. All right. Encouraging friendly relations, and they're advocating peace and trying to settle international disputes. All right. They also oppose the use of force and the use of nuclear weapons. This is a lesson learned, especially between the Soviet Union and the United States with the Cuban Missile Crisis, coming to the brink of destruction and then walking away. They know that using force and the use of nuclear weapons is not the way to go, and these type of countries don't adopt nuclear weapons. To strengthen the United Nations as a organ of world peace, and to protect human lives and protect the environment. We're starting to see that, and how does that play? Well, we start to see that this kind of affects Russia, the Soviet Union, more than the United States, and I'll explain further when we get into the next couple of slides. We see ourselves kind of jump ahead, and we introduce ourselves into the 1980s, and we have these two new leaders that change the direction of the Cold War. For the United States, we have President Ronald Reagan. He wins the presidency in 1980. He actually is our president from 1980 to 1988. He serves 2 terms, a very strong, robust type of president who is a Republican, but his big thing is kind of big army, big presence, and wants to stop Russia and the Soviet Union, to stop them in their tracks and to stop the spread of communism. On the flip side of that, you have the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev sees himself as the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, and he takes over the Soviet Union during a time frame where they're being devastated with the war that they have with Afghanistan. They're not making a lot of money, and they're not advancing technologically the way the United States is. The United States refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, and the way that they try to combat the Soviet Union is by increasing their spending and the size of the military at the time. We're talking about the army increasing in size, the Navy. He has a vision for the United States Navy, making it a 500 ship Navy. So he's spending a lot of money when it comes to defense, and he's using the military to do that, to combat the Soviet Union and to combat the spread of communism. As I mentioned before, Gorbachev finds himself in a situation where he needs to do something in order for the Soviet Union to continue to be a superpower, just like the United States. So they go into and they start introducing these two new concepts. Now, remember, when Russia or the Soviet Union adopts communism, the government controls everything. Okay, you hear stories of like bread lines and people who are doctors and carpenters, but they both make the same amount of money because it's all about the good of the country, right? It's not about how the United States, where we have this democratic lifestyle and capitalism, where we have the freedom to make as much money as we want. We can go into private business and enterprise. It's not like that in the Soviet Union. The government controls everything, and this is starting to not work for them. So in the next slide, we see that Mikhail Gorbachev goes ahead and starts to introduce these two very important reforms. The first one is called Glasnost, and the second one is called Perestroika. All right. Two words that are kind of a little bit difficult to pronounce, but let's go ahead and start. So we see these reforms, and Glasnost is what it means is transparency to improve freedom of expression and following ways. And what they do is they're kind of tight, loosening this iron fist where the government controlled everything, and they controlled the media, they controlled the press, they controlled every aspect of living and government in the country. Glasnost is reform that kind of loosened the reins or the tight grip that the government has on its people, and they do it in ways of, as examples of freedom of the press. They're allowing news to be actually reported in real time, and it's not being influenced. Access to the Western press. Now the country, Soviet Union, are starting to access media outlets from different countries. The creation of political unions that oppose communism. This is very big. We see that the workforce is more about the good of the country, where now we start seeing where the workforce are starting to rise up, and we see the implementation of unions. Banned books that challenged Soviet history or communist rule were published in large editions. Again, this is this tight rein where the government controls everything. So any book that showed the Soviet Union in a bad light, it was banned and it was taken off the shelves. Now they're starting to see that these books are now becoming accessible again. Dissidents are released from prison. So these are individuals who fought against the government, that didn't believe in the government. So the communist government took these people and they threw them in jail. We're starting to see that they're releasing them. Greater religious tolerance and freedom to travel to the Western country. We start seeing that Soviet Union or Russians are able to leave the country and actually go to different parts of the world. On the other side, we have Perestroika. Perestroika is the restructuring of the government and economy that led in the following changes. We see that farmers were allowed to sell goods on the free market. We start to see this change where they start to implement or allow people to create businesses and create this free market that is not tied to the Soviet Union government, to communism. We start to see that it supports limited private ownership, where people are able to create businesses and not share with the government. they're able to keep proceeds, and they're able to extend their business beyond the borders of Russia or beyond the borders of the Soviet Union into other countries. We also see the appointment of new members to their government, and they're starting to reduce their bureaucracy, which is basically reducing the size of the government. Again, Glasnost and Perestroika are reforms that help loosen the tight grip that the government had around their people and around how they took care of business politically and monetarily. Okay? Let's go to the next slide. So Glasnost and Perestroika impacted Gorbachev's relationship with the Soviet Union and satellite states. Communist Party indirectly controlled all levels of government. All right. So what we see here in this small little map, this area right here is Russia. Okay. These different satellite countries that surround Russia together make the Soviet Union. Now, these end up becoming Soviet satellites, and they are kind of like their own country. However, they have very little political freedom because it's Russia or the communist government that controls everything. But we start seeing a shift in the way the government is loosening the reins of these satellite states. So in 1988, Gorbachev announced that he abandoned the idea of limited sovereignty for the Soviet Union republics in Eastern Europe. He declared that all countries had the right to decide what kind of political and economic system they wanted. This is kind of like the cause and effect of Glasnost and Perestroika. Okay, giving the freedom or these reforms to help the Soviet government to continue to have influence over all their satellite states eventually gives power to these satellite states to kind of grow more independent. And this is where we start seeing influence later on in our documents, which is the fall of the Berlin Wall, which eventually leads to the Soviet Union collapsing and the influence of communism kind of dissipating. All right. So I want to go ahead and move into the documents. Okay. And the document, you're going to have two particular documents. You're going to have President Reagan's Berlin Wall speech, and you're having an excerpt of it, and there's a video. As I mentioned earlier in this particular video, that you have the opportunity to listen and watch President Reagan deliver his speech. It's good that you read it and listen, and I want you to pay attention to the emphasis that he makes in how he delivers the speech and how powerful he delivers those words and influences trying to influence the Soviet government to let go of their communist ways and let go of the control of Berlin in Germany. Okay. When you read the speech and you watch the video, go ahead and answer these questions. Okay. Now we get to the second document. The second document is a little bit different. We have a text in here that talks about after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and what happens to the Soviet Union and how it kind of sets in motion the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then you have a political cartoon here. Political cartoon is called Gorbachev Faces the Soviets Crack Problem, which is not the drug crack, but the kind of like the crackling that you see like in a foundation or in a cement wall, where it becomes the integrity of the structure becomes compromised. It's kind of like that. You start to see the integrity of communism is starting to crack, and that's what you see here. So I want you to take a look at this and answer the two questions based on the text and this political cartoon. Pay attention to this second question because the question is going to ask you how Glasnost, Perestroika, and President Reagan's speech contributed to Gorbachev's fear of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I'm asking you to kind of go back to Google Slides to refresh your knowledge on Glasnost and Perestroika. When you're done with that, save your answers and go ahead and submit your document. Okay. Keep in mind that this assignment is due on Friday, April 24th by midnight. And as always, if you have any problems with understanding the document, or you're not sure, or maybe you need a little bit of assistance, please don't be hesitant in sending myself, Miss Corey, or Miss Figario an email so we can set up a time frame and give you that one-on-one, or you can come visit us at our office hours and we can help you that way as well. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of the video / presentation and mini lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. It was very informative. This is Mr. Melendez, and I am punching out. Have a good day.